The real reason the United States is involved in Ukraine is because as long as we keep a proxy war happening in a third world country like Ukraine, as long as we have that proxy war coming, we're wasting Russian resources. And as we waste and deplete Russian resources, we only have to compete against one other country in the world, China. If the war in Ukraine ends, Russia starts to rebuild in concert with China, and now we have two enemies without either of them depleting themselves, right? So that's one big reason why the United States likes war in Ukraine. Another reason why the United States likes war in Ukraine is because as long as we are creating weapons and sending weapons to Ukraine, we're practicing for a future global conflict that we might have to carry out against China. It's no small feat to send tanks 7,000 miles across an ocean. It's no small feat to create ammunition loaded into C-17s and then fly them as a fleet by fleet into Poland and then carry out the logistical challenges of delivering that material to the front lines. We're practicing war. Without fighting it.
I feel like we would have that down pretty good now after 20 years of war all over the Middle East.
The difference is we had our own bases in the Middle East. If we go to war, who's the most likely person we're going to go to war with?
China.
China is 15,000 miles away. 15,000 miles away. Afghanistan is half that distance. And we have bases in Afghanistan. We don't have any bases in China. The nearest that we would be able to get is actually the Philippines, where we would have to have a presidential allowance by the Filipino president to use their bases, right? And that's happening right now. So we would have to borrow and coordinate diplomatically with a host nation to be able to deliver our weapons to that country, which is exactly what we're doing in Poland right now, right? They're not our bases. We're working with the Poles. So it's a different kind of beast. 7,000 miles is very different from 15,000 miles. You're talking about multiple aerial refuelings. You're talking about months on if you're delivering something by sea. You're talking about multiple stops if you're delivering something by air, right?
It would just be a quick stop in Ramstein, Germany.
We would like to think of it. So a quick stop in Ramstein, Germany for 25 aircraft to then deliver weapons into a hostile zone and into a non-American controlled base. Right?
Okay.
It's very different than what we had in the Middle East.
All right.
Right? And who were we combating in the Middle East? Terrorists, not organized nation states and national armies.
Okay.
Now all of a sudden, you send a C-17 into Afghanistan and you have to worry about small arms fire, and you have to worry about whether or not they got their hands on some kind of shoulder-carried, shoulder-mounted anti-aircraft. Delivering something to Taiwan or the Philippines, you got to get near China. You got to go near China's allies, and you have ships at sea that have anti-aircraft weapons. You have laser-guided munitions. You have hypersonic missiles. It's a very different risk element.
That's a damn good point.
Yeah. So then the last kind of big reason is we can't consider what's happening in Europe separate from what's happening in the United States. So when there's war in general, dating back to World War II, we've always known war is really good for the economy. The Biden administration, whether you're pro-Biden or anti-Biden, the empirical evidence shows that our COVID response under President Biden destroyed the U.S. economy. And most of the first world followed America's lead with our COVID response and destroyed their economies too, which is why you see massive economic collapse all across Europe, all throughout Asia, and all the countries that followed our lead, right? We overreacted to something we didn't understand. And now as a result, inflation is rampant, recession is pending. So our government, it's really important to our administration that we never formally announce a recession. We are in a recession. You feel it, I feel it, everybody watching us feels it, we know it. Our dollar doesn't go as far. It's hard to get people to go to work. Like, life is hard. We are in an economic recession. It's not like it was in 2010. But according to economics, as outlined by national institutes, we are not yet in a recession. because their definition of recession requires 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. We're not going to have negative GDP growth. Why? Because we're funding a war in Ukraine, right? If you look at the top 5 military contractors out there right now, if you pull it up on your computer anytime, look at Lockheed Martin, look at Raytheon, look at Boeing. There's a big company that very few people know about called Leidos. I'm sure you've known Leidos. Just look at their stock dating back to June of last year. June of last year, when the stock market started to tank, these companies tanked along with it. And then February came along. February, the invasion started. The United States started offering military aid to Ukraine, and the stock price of those companies started going up because government spending started going into this Ukraine effort. That means the federal government started boosting military efforts. They started boosting humanitarian efforts, medical efforts. All of that government spending in an existing industry, the military industrial industry, actually inflated the GDP numbers for those productive segments of the society, of the sector, those industrial segments, right? So now the United States is still suffering from a massive drop in GDP. I think our GDP last quarter was 2.8%, right? Down from like 5%. But it's being boosted because we're funding this war in Ukraine. If we gave up on the war in Ukraine, that productivity of those sectors would go down, and we would actually have to announce a recession.
Okay.
So the Biden administration is artificially protecting us from recession by selectively funding certain segments of our industrial base that are tied to this conflict in Europe.
I mean, when it comes to the not announcing a recession, does this actually benefit anybody but Raytheon, Boeing, the military companies?
So,
or is this just a mask? Do you know what I mean?
I do, yeah.
So is this like, hey, just do this, then we won't have to call it a recession because you just said, I feel it, you feel it, everybody feels it, So, yeah, maybe we're funding these 5 companies, but what about everybody else?
It's not just those companies that are reaping the benefits, right? Remember, the military industrial base is certainly benefiting from a war in Europe, but so is the medical base, right? Band-Aid and gauze manufacturers, alcohol manufacturers, tape manufacturers, all the body armor that goes into it, right? Think about all the steel, all the powder, all the charcoal that goes into creating the munitions and the weapons. Like there's lots of secondary and tertiary sectors that benefit from the same conflict. But the place where you can most clearly see the benefit is with your military industrial complex.
Okay.
Now, your question, is there actually a benefit to anyone, or is it just a mask? Again, putting on that CIA transparency, truthfulness hat, the answer is both. It is absolutely a mask. America's intentions have very little to do with protecting Ukraine. And we'll talk about that in just a second, right? But that's the mask part. We want the world to think, and of course the Biden administration wants Americans to think, that the most important reason that we're involved is we're protecting democracy. That's not the most important reason. There is a mask element. But then there is an element where we really do benefit. When America prevents itself from announcing a recession, it means that consumers like you and I always have uncertainty, right? Uncertainty is not ideal, but uncertainty is much better than certainty that we are having a recession. As soon as the government announces a recession, people stop buying, people stop spending, the economy really does react, right? Because it's no longer speculation, it's confirmed fact. When GDP shrinks, now all of a sudden they're going to have to deal with actual Americans not going out anymore. Americans not being uncertain, but actually being afraid. So they want to prevent that from happening. And they can prevent that from happening by never allowing us to enter into recessionary status. Even though you and I feel it, the truth is that according to like the economic laws that we follow as a country, we're not yet in a recession. There's 5 indicators. We've hit 4 of the indicators, but we haven't hit the 5th indicator yet. We haven't had that negative GDP growth for 2 consecutive quarters. If you like this short clip, make sure you click here to see the next clip or here to see the full podcast episode.